We are going to focus on this focal question. How can companies extend the useful life of IT assets and more effectively manage e-waste at the end of life? So that's what we'll be focusing on primarily during this session today. I'll just set us up a little bit, and I'll start with Kabira while we're waiting for our other panelists. But the motivation is pretty clear. The material value of the electronic waste discarded globally each year adds up to 62.5 billion. That's more than the GDP of most countries. So, and there's a lot of different reasons why this is the case, some of which we'll probe into now, but this could be more of a 3-day long session to get into everything. But one of the big factors is incongruous regulations, right? So they're different in every jurisdiction. And there's a lot of different devices, obviously. It's a little bit different for each device, a PC, a tablet, a smartphone, data center servers, storage and networking gear, all of these things have different considerations. So we're going to hear from 2 people today. And the person we've got online right now is Kabira Stokes, and she's the CEO of Retriever. So they're a startup backed by Closed Loop Partners that's focused on the issue of electronics collection and also apparel as well. She was the founder of Isidore Electronics Recycling, which in 2016 became part of Homeboy Recycling. We will have another speaker here in a moment, fingers crossed, and I'll introduce her when she comes in, but she's with Iron Mountain, Jamesetta Strickland, Senior Vice President and Head of Global Business Services, which focuses on IT asset management services. So she'll be joining us in a moment, but while we're waiting, let's get started. And one of the things that as I was thinking about how to make this conversation a little bit different was really to talk about this issue of electronic stuff, not necessarily as waste, but as how do we really get at the intrinsic value of this material, of these objects? Maybe if we reframe the conversation and think of it this way, we can think about different models of addressing it. So, Kabira, in your mind, what is the intrinsic value of what we might call electronic waste?
Sure. I mean, in one way, we can talk about this later as well, but I think so much of it is around the framing of it, right? So we call it electronic waste, but what if we did think of them as assets? So I think that's one of sort of the frames for me for today. But in terms of intrinsic value, I mean, we can start with the very basic, the raw materials that have been extracted from our earth to make all these gadgets. So in electronics, there's gold and there's palladium, there's silver, there's rare earth metals. These are precious materials. As we know, there's finite amounts of them. Mm-hmm. A couple of fun facts for you is there's more gold in a ton of electronic waste than 17 tons of gold ore. And there is more landfilled rare earth metals than are left in all known remaining mineable deposits. So we have already taken these things out of our earth and they're in our gadgets now. So how is it waste if that's where all of our precious materials are?
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Oh,
hi
my
there.
goodness. Oh.
Thank you.
Okay.
We didn't miss a beat. You're just on time. You're just on time.
That was, sorry about that. I tried everything yesterday and I was set up completely and then it did not recognize me this morning.
This is our new world. No worries at all, James said.
I have a little bit of background noise, so I'm going to put my headphones on.
Okay.
All right.
I was going to direct a question to you. So, as I was just asking Kabira about sort of the framing of this, right? So intuitively speaking, information technology, we know that it represents an environmental concern, not just for individuals, but for businesses. But how do we switch the paradigm? How do we take a look at these materials, these objects, and really get thinking differently about the value of these things?
Yeah, I think it's a good and thoughtful question, right? And many businesses that we interact with, as well as customers and their customers, grapple with this. So a couple of points I would make around it is, certainly I think everybody would agree that the technology environment has exploded, right? Because there's so many devices, whether you're talking phones, computers, data centers, everything. So there's a lot of stuff to deal with and a lot more emerging regulations against which to comply and manage, right? So with that premise, what you kind of find is actually kind of to support that. I know there was every year the United Nations puts out information about waste. And so when you think about the amount of e-waste, according to the UN's latest report, roughly almost 60 million tons of just electronic waste is generated around the globe, and probably roughly 20 to 25% of people and institutions are responsibly dealing with it in some way. Yet you see it becoming more a part of the forefront, the way that corporations and businesses and consumers are looking at it as part of their overall environmental, social, and governance strategy. So as an example, in the case of Iron Mountain, certainly forefront for us, certainly forefront for our customers. And when to your point about the paradigm shift, this paradigm shift is real, because we did a study along with CIO Magazine, and the most recent study. So the question was, if you're an IT professional or a CIO leader of a business, when you think about IT assets, what's your number one issue? It used to be around data privacy, which is certainly still important, but recently we saw them rank the sustainability and responsibility for disposing of that as their number one issue. So I think that paradigm, making it more part of, where it's not an afterthought in terms of end of life, and shifting the discussion from just thinking of it as, e-waste, but more how do you manage the total life cycle of that asset, much like you would any product manager would manage the product life cycle, managing the complete asset life cycle. And when you think about it as end of life, you're a lot more thoughtful if you couple that with the overall ESG goals. Putting those both together, to me, it is the way to make the paradigm shift. And like I say, I think the paradigm shift is really the more companies and consumers and NGOs are embracing it and looking at it that way.
So I want to go back to something that Kibera was saying just before you logged on, and she was giving us some amazing stats. The one that really just struck me was more gold in 1 ton of electronic waste, or whatever you want to call it, than 17 tons of gold ore. I was like, what? I mean, that is just so how, and maybe this is more to Kibera than to you, James, set up, but so to go back to that point that you were making, like, how is that value accounted for right now? Who owns that? Who quote owns that? And why? So this stuff is in there. Why aren't we properly getting at it? Or who is? Or what member of the chain is actually able to appreciate that value?
Well, I mean, at the moment, it's in terms of the raw materials, it's the recyclers, and the recyclers are trying to get as much as possible. But as James said, it's at best 25% of electronics recycled. So there's a huge, just unbelievable amount of wasted value. And I think for me, and I think you might ask a question about this later, but so much of it has to do with lack of just no education about the fact that this is a precious. These are made of our precious materials, that there's data security concerns, and that there's toxins in these that need to be managed correctly. So just to answer the next part, the final part of your last question about the intrinsic value, the other piece is that there's jobs to be created around managing this correctly, right? So there's the data security jobs, great, but there's also as in these strange times, as we're seeing that, we can't export everything to China anymore. Why do we want to dump this on the shores of India, et cetera, et cetera? Can this be actually a job creator here in America? Yeah. And so I think that's another piece of the value that is it's missing. And the recycling industry is there. There's players that have been around forever, new players popping up, but it's there to be built.
So I do want to go to that whole issue of job creation in a moment, but to stick with sort of the valuation issue right now, we have ways of calculating the carbon, the value of removing carbon or investing in renewable energy. How do you account for what you're getting out of managing this properly? So as a company, what credit do they get?
Well, I would like to comment on that. So one of the things, just playing off this whole carbon credit thing, we're trying to work with our clients to understand how we can enable them to get carbon offset credits for the sustainability and their best practices around e-waste. And so, for example, I know we have a number of initiatives that we're piloting where they would be able to get sustainability credits. And we also have reporting capability that they can use to say, for everything I did not send to a landfill, that I'm, becoming more responsible, allows them to sort of capitalize both on the intrinsic value and then, the value that their shareholders are looking for. So we have a number of reports, and we're piloting how this could even be used for carbon type offsets, because in the whole ecosystem, you're doing better by the economy. And by the environment. And when you think about it, to your point, there's lots of different elements that are involved or contained, lots of different materials, copper, gold, all these other things, and even certainly they emit greenhouse gases as well. And so there is, I don't want to overlook the carbon offset piece of that, as well as some other sort of reporting that we're able our clients to do around the goodness that they do for the environment.
Have you seen any attempt at valuation in your experience, Kabira?
There's a long road ahead on that, I think. It's because I think that the missing piece here in many ways is also just the reuse value. And it's just so much of this is designed for the dump, and it's not even thought about as that someone else might want your old iPhone or whatever it might be. So, I mean, the reuse market is there to be conquered in many ways. So I think that when you take into account, I think the number that's thrown around is like $55 billion is wasted every year by not recycling and reusing these products. So that's one number that's there. But I think that we're only just scratching the surface.
Yeah, I would agree, because to your point, Kabira, it's about everyone's ability to assign value to the various aspects that we're discussing. But I do think a lot more is being done and being thought about. And then in the end, there are going to be some things that you can value, and they'll be a little bit more straightforward. On the other hand, if you think about social responsibility, and we can have a whole long panel around the debate around the planet and such, but you either believe in that and it's the thing to do for yourselves, for your families, and for our businesses, or not, right? So there'll be some elements that you can place immediate assignable value, and then some of it you just know it makes sense and it's sustainable, and we know we're doing things to help the environment overall. Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a landmine question, but what role should the hardware manufacturers bear in managing the electronic waste? So they're the ones that created it. How should they be part of the solution?
I have some thoughts on this one.
Okay, I'll let you go first, and I have some thoughts too.
Go for it.
Well, I think that, yes, there's lots of thoughts out there, right? So I think what I just said, they're not designing for the dump. So, I mean, the fact that you could upgrade your software and that would make your hardware obsolete is just insane. So I think just understanding that whether a customer pays $50 or $1,000, there should be some sort of expectation that actually lasts. So that's one part. It's looking really at the design. On the next side, I think, is just on education. There was I don't know how many folks in this world read Waste Dive, but there was a really interesting article last week about, it came out, there was a study that 3 in 5 young Americans, that means Gen Z and millennials, don't know what e-waste is, and that 60% of them throw it in the trash. And that to me is a marketing problem. it's that, and that's on manufacturers and that's on retailers, right? At the point of sale and in advertising of these, why is this not discussed? And no, there's not an immediate revenue opportunity there for the manufacturers or retailers, but maybe there is, because also Gen Z and millennials care about the environment. So, and then just the convenience and availability of recycling programs. I mean, you can drop things off at Best Buy and places like that, but how hard are brands pushing? And it's the same, it's the other side of the education, right? How hard are brands actually pushing their recycling programs? Because most of them have them, there's compliance they need to meet, but how bare bones is it, and how much broader could it actually be? And then the last piece for me is just, are they putting money where their mouth is in terms of funding innovation and like looking really at how do we increase collection and how do we get to actually advanced recycling? I saw there was a comment in the chat about how shredding is so, it's not efficient. We're not getting the most value out of these things. So what's next? What's the innovation coming down the road in electronic recycling that's actually going to extract more and more of our precious materials out? So those are my thoughts.
I would say, to add on to that, I agree that, there's a lot of players in this ecosystem, right? But the two most important ones, you could argue, are the OEM and the consumers, right? In between, obviously, there's the ITAD, or the asset destruction firms, there's remanufacturers, resellers, refiners, all these sort of other players in the ecosystem. But those two, the OEM, to Kira's point, and the end user, are the most important two constituents or players to connect and be aligned, both from an education point of view, from a expectations point of view, and then as well just behavior around this. And so I think those are the two most important stakeholders in it, and each one has a role to play. To pick up on one of the points that was made, I think, in the chat, it's around, if you talk about the Gen Xers and the newer generations, I think there's a link not only just to education and in terms of schools, but for parents and others, because as more of those folks come into the workplace, if you think about it from a design systems thinking, if they're coming in thinking about this, they're bringing that lens, right? They're bringing that lens of how they want to design products, the work that they want to work on, how they can change the practices and behaviors of their workplaces and places that they live. But in the end, like I said, even though there are a lot of players in the ecosystem, I agree with Kabira that it ultimately comes down to not only the OEMs or manufacturers, but the link to consumers.
Right. So with that in mind, how might the as a service, right, model play a role in addressing this problem? So things like leased or and then recirculated after a certain period. How could they play a role in addressing the issue? Kabira.
I went first last time. I look like James.
James said it. I was just
right. Thanks, Kabira. So a couple of thoughts that I would say there is, when you think about it as a pecking order of what's best for the environment that you might do, so you might say, obviously, remarketing and reusing it is best, right? And so anyone, a service provider or in support of companies, whether it's a corporation that this is not their end game, like they just are a user of IT assets, any way that as a service we can support them thinking through, as I mentioned before, that end of life and having a pecking order, if you will, around try to reuse it first versus sort of recycling. Because I think a lot of firms and people in our own regular lives feel good about recycling, but not necessarily thinking about it a little bit more forward in terms of reuse. Right. That's a whole, we are at the circularity conference, right? So the whole thought linking education, and I do think that we have a role to play, both as in the service industry, helping our clients along, figuring that out, making the right choices up front, and then all the way back to the original design of what they're using and how they're using their IT assets is what I would think. So it's more about shifting. We talk about the paradigm shifting, but thinking about reuse and circularity, and not just settling for automatically I'm doing okay because I'm recycling a part of it.
I want to add collection to that, Kabira. Like if you added collection to that service, especially since this is what you focus on, like what about that, right? It's about getting it to somewhere too. That's part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so, I was in the electronics recycling industry for many years, and we were primarily B2B. And there was this inkling I always had in my head, which was, well, but are we getting to consumers? Like, how are we actually getting to them? And there are drop-off locations, and there are recycling events and mail-in programs. But at the end of the day, we recycle paper bottles and cans because trucks come to our houses, most houses. So that's what we do at Retriever, is looking to see how can we actually innovate around doorstep collection of electronics, also clothing, another hard to recycle item. Mm-hmm. So I think the collection piece is actually part of the key of circularity. It's one of them. How are we extracting these items before they get in the garbage? That's really one of the big questions. And I think just to follow up on the as a service model, I mean, I'll just tell a very quick story. With my company, Homeboy Recycling and Isidore in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, probably about 8 years ago or so, was going to decommission 10,000 computers. And they were going to go to the Department of Sanitation. That's where the computers were set to go. And there was a new mayor in, and the new mayor and some folks in his office and in sanitation, and along with us, were like, why would these be tagged as waste? These are working computers in many cases. They can be given to people who do not have computers. And so amazingly, that there was an order by the mayor's office, and suddenly they were reclassified from waste to assets. And that is exactly what James said is talking about in terms of the paradigm shift. Also has to be actual policy shifts of the way that we define these items, because they're not waste. They are precious, and there's use left.
And I would agree. I saw the comment there from Brooks, and then another comment about the incentives. How do we incentivize people to, reduce first, mm-hmm. reuse, and then recycle? Mm-hmm. And how do you incentivize people to do it that way? And it's not just for individuals, even for corporations. And as you look at, for corporations, the whole focus on ESG being a part of what all of our shareholders and boards want from us, it makes these types of things even more germane for mm-hmm. corporations as well.
So to kind of loop back to something we alluded to at the beginning, the issue of jobs creation, and also, frankly, mm-hmm. the digital divide that has become very, very pronounced in this situation that we're in now. How might we find a way to intersect these two issues, address the digital divide with these assets? Any thoughts on that intersection?
Yeah, I'll start on this. I'm very passionate about this topic. When you think about the digital divide, I mean, heck, it's as simple as, can be as simple as, when you think about reusing and repurposing IT assets, there are plenty of people who in this whole mm-hmm. environment need them, right? So whether you're talking about repurposing them for education or repurposing them for disadvantaged neighborhoods, repurposing them even globally, to me, it's just a natural link. And you'll see a lot of companies have, they are able to repurpose their IT assets and also partner it with what they're doing in communities. Individuals can do that as well. And I just think, to me, that's just sort of an easy thing where you can do good for the environment and do good for the people in it. But yeah, I think that's a just go do from my perspective.
Yeah. Kabir, a last word for you.
I would just say on the job creation side, I mean, I'll just say it again. I mean, the massive undertaking that's ahead of us to actually meet climate change and mitigate it. We're not going to stop it anymore, but we can mitigate it and adapt to it. Is going to be a major job creator. And I think that what we were trying to do at Isidore and at Homeboy, and still do there, is to think about the people that were left out of the gray economy, of the dirty economy, and actually try to be inclusive and bring them in. Mm-hmm. And that means different hiring practices, specific around people with criminal records, around people with histories of addiction and homelessness. So I think that's the opportunity before us. And I think with, if we bring in the digital divide, that's even more jobs in terms of refurbishing and getting it out there and And there's a real opportunity for us as we move forward.
Great.
And I think people don't have to start from scratch. I mean, e-stewards and a few other of the regulatory bodies have a lot of good programming around how to start and think about this.
I hate to do this, but we're out of time.
Oh, we're out of time already.
I know, it's like a blink.
That means it was a great discussion.
I would be remiss. Totally. Please take the survey. It really helps us folks understand what we can do better the next time. So thank you so much. Thank you to James Setta and Kabir for being here. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hate that we can't keep talking, but I got to go to the main stage, and so do you all. So bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.